So, good morning. My name is Mosunmola Ogunmolaji, and I'm here with
Vasilios Kosmakos.
Okay, so we're from the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, and today is February 11th, 2022. We're currently at the OakAmerk at Gainesville, Florida, and I am interviewing
Bruce DeLaney.
Nice to meet you, sir. Would like if you could kindly introduce yourself.
Sure. For over 30 years, I was the director of real estate, then the assistant vice president for real estate for the University of Florida Foundation. And in that role, I did a lot of different things for them. One of which was I was involved with the development of OakAmerk from really the very initial conception until I was in charge of construction and was sort of the last guy to leave when we opened.
Yeah, that's great. Could you tell us how you started, how you got involved with OakAmerk?
Sure. There's a story about how OakAmerk started that begins around 1998, but it actually began around 1991. The foundation was approached by the owner of some apartments on Southwest 34th Street, Piccadilly, and behind them was a large mobile home park, and it was for sale, and I can't remember whether it was 15, 20, 25 acres total. But he approached us with the idea to redevelop the site. On the frontage would be the University Hotel and Conference Center, and in the back would be a continuing care retirement community. So we took that idea to President Lombardi and explained it to him, and he said no. But he said he liked both ideas, he just didn't want them to be the same, on the same site. So he instructed us to explore, the development of a hotel and conference center, and to explore the CCRC idea. And so I ended up getting on a committee that resulted in where the Hilton Hotel and Conference Center is now. Dr. Wrights was still, former president, was a volunteer, had an office at the University Foundation, and told me we were probably the 5th or 6th conference center committee, but we were the ones that finally got it done. But he also appointed a committee. David Challoner, who was an executive with UF Health, was in charge of it. And we investigated the idea. There was a committee of a number of deans and other people at the university. Eventually, they went on a couple of site visits. I know they went to, I think it's called the Colonnades at the University of Virginia. I went on that trip. They had another trip that I did not go on. We thought that it was a great idea. But then we started doing some demographic studies. And at the average move-in age that we were told, this is back in 1991 or 92, that people would have attended the University of Florida was right around the start of World War II. And so when we went back and looked in the Alumni Association records, during the war years, we had less than 100 good names of former Gators. But when the university exploded after the GI Bill, after the war, by the late 1940s, we had over 1,000 good names of Gators. And the idea was we thought that 60 or 75% of the people who would move here would be former Gators. And so the decision was made that it's a great idea, the demographics aren't right, and let's put this thing off for a few years.
I'm sorry, explain what good names are.
Pardon?
What are good names?
Good names for?
You just mentioned the term good names to refer to Gators that returned from after the war.
Well, we just thought that you mean good names. Good names where we could actually contact people that were former UF students and ask them, hey, are you interested in something like this? And so there weren't very many of them at the ages that we were told that people would move in. And actually, when we finally opened, I think our average move-in age was 4 or 5 years younger than CCRC developers had told us the national studies indicated the average person who moved in was like 78 years old, I think I remember. And I think when we first filled up, we were probably an average moving age of the early to mid 70s. And so,
earlier on you mentioned CCRC. Can you tell us about what CCRC is?
A CCRC is a continuing care retirement community,
Okay.
Which is what OakAmerk is. It's a special entity in the law and so forth. It combines all of the services you might need as you get older so that you could age in place, so that you pay a flat fee and then you pay a level rent. And when you're living in independent living in your apartment or your club home, it probably sounds a little bit expensive, but if you then need to move on to assisted living or skilled nursing, it becomes, a very affordable number. And so people who are retiring and had a fixed income say, hey, if I can afford this, then I won't go broke, with the nursing home bills and things like that at the end. And so, but anyway, once we made the decision to wait a few years, then the new effort started around 1998. The university was approached by the Praxis corporation. Particularly, one of the leaders there was a guy named Matt Weaver. And that rekindled the idea, and it got legs, and the president approved it, and a board of directors was initially appointed. That included a number of deans, Dean Gudikins of health-related professions, for example, that would different colleges that might well have a relationship with a facility if it was going to have the university's name on it, and so forth. And so one of the things that we did was the Florida Today magazine, the university alumni magazine, we put an ad in the magazine and asked people to, hey, is this an idea you'd be interested in? And we had really a overwhelming response, we thought at the time, of people saying, yeah, great idea. So the next step was to contact those people and say, hey, would you put up $1,000 refundable deposit just to get your name on the list, because it was going to be very expensive, and we were going to have to sell bonds, and you needed to convince the bond people that it was going to be a viable project economically and so forth. And so that worked out quite well, and a very good number of those people that put up the refundable deposit later converted and became founding members of OakAmerk. So the initial committees were involved in the design of the facility, everything from the type of furniture we would buy and interior decorating to landscaping and so forth. My wife was the city and the county. We had to, once we found a site that I'll talk about in a minute, both the city and the county were very excited about the economic development aspects of this, because we're going to have several hundred jobs, and we were going to be bringing people to town that would spend their money here and so forth. And so my wife was the mayor, and she was on the founding board of directors. She worked on a couple of committees with deans and so forth. Former president Marshall Kreiser's wife was heavily involved. Paula Kreiser, they were founding members, and so. But in that design phase, I had a role. I would say it was somewhat minor, but I was at all the meetings. But what I ended up doing was picking the site, which was a process. I did all of the zoning and land use. I did all the neighborhood meetings. And the site plan development. And the site was very unique. But when we hadn't picked the site yet, and I was the real estate guy, and I was supposed to go out and find all these potential sites. And I found sites that were, from US 441 north of Gainesville, between Gainesville and Alachua and the university's research park. There was a couple out there that were interested in moving in, and they offered their site and would give us a great big discount if they got an apartment when they got to move in and so forth. But I had some other sites that were out in West Gainesville. But I actually tried to rig the site selection, I will confess, after all these years. I was the founding chair of the redevelopment district adjacent to campus. And between campus and downtown was the old county hospital, Alachua General Hospital, that Shands UF Health had acquired. I was close with some of the people at UF Health because we were almost like the founding people of Innovation Square. And I knew that Alachua General was eventually going to have to close. And it was very sad. My father was a surgeon in Gainesville. He was the first board-certified surgeon in Gainesville after World War II, and spent his whole career at Alachua General. And so it was sad. My children were born there, and so forth. But it was just going to cost too much to renovate it. Was one of the issues at the end. And so we went out to our $1,000 depositors, and we gave them a poll to see where they would like to have this facility that they were interested in. So what I did was I said north of town, south of town, east of town, west of town, downtown, or between campus and downtown. So my plan was to take east, downtown, and between there and add those up and say, see, everybody wants to go to this redevelopment site, and we were going to make it would have been an urban project, multi-story buildings and so forth. I failed, and all of our depositors essentially wanted a campus-like facility, and we joked that they essentially wanted us to build it on the shores of Lake Alice. So as close to campus as we could get, but a campus-like facility. They sort of rejected my urban facility idea. So let's see. So I ended up identifying 10 sites and took them to the board, and a handful of them were rejected. And then I was tasked with seeing what kind of a price and other deal I could make on the various sites. And to make the long story short, we ended up here. The property was owned by Prairie View Trust, which was the Henderson family, primarily in town. My parents had divorced, and my mother had remarried to a man named Earl Powers, who owned a piece of Prairie View Trust. And when we began to zero in on this as our favorite site, my mother and Earl Powers were very instrumental in talking the Henderson family into contributing a quarter of the value as a gift to the university. And we had the state had a matching gift program back then. So when the deal closed, I think the number was $800 and something thousand was a gift to the university, and the matching gift program created what at the time is now the Powers Professorship in the College of Nursing. But the idea was to endow a faculty position in geriatric nursing. And so that took $600,000, and the state matched that with $420. It was a match percentage thing. And then the Henderson family dictated where the other two, they made, I think, 2 other gifts there, one in the College of Business and one in the College of Medicine. And those were also matchable gifts. So we had a sort of a charitable part of this. But when we started to develop the site, I was able to, I hired Ing Denman, which is EDA now, and we got some old DOT aerials that dated back to the late 1930s. And this entire site was the forest you come through getting in here, but the south half had been a pasture because it was a dairy farm until about 1960. And so we had aerial photographs up into the 60s when the cows were taken off, and the south half of the property was a lot of open pasture. And so we called it the we called that open pasture area because it had been, old field succession had taken place. Here we are 30 or 40 years later. And so we called that the 5 and 10 inch forest. And then we called everything between really the main buildings and the highway out there as the 30 or 40 inch forest. And so the entire site was subject to the Serenola Specials Area Study Plan because it was environmentally sensitive and we're close to Payne's Prairie. The special area study required that 50% of the site be set aside and essentially be untouched as preservation land. And so, the southern half was about half and the northern half was about half. And so we preserved the northern half and its zoning won't allow development to occur up there. And so that was an interesting part of it. During that time, I became known as the tree hugger. And I wanted to protect as much of the property as we could because it's a real gem of an asset for the project. And so we hired local attorney Ron Carpenter to take us through the zoning that we required, and all of that went well. We were in the county at the time, and so we went through the county zoning process. At the time, the project was touted as being the largest construction project ever in Alachua County. It's no longer that big, but it was at the time. And so from the economic development aspects and so forth, the county commission was excited, the city commission was excited, and so all the zoning and everything went well. We had a number of neighborhood meetings, particularly over in Idlewild area. We offered to do things like create off-road trails over to the school so that residents could go over and be, I think the term then was rocking readers and help volunteer at the school and so forth. And interestingly enough, the neighborhood said no. And so, but we offered a lot of things like that. We had, I think, a unanimous vote for our zoning. And I think everyone was pretty pleased at the time.
So discuss the ecological value of the land you just mentioned and how that's been an asset to the residents.
Well, as we developed the project, there are walking trails. I laid them all out in the woods. I laid out all the roads. The main road, when you come in, there's several curves. I tried to have a vista of a fantastic, oak tree or something at the end of every line of sight. And so it's very peaceful up in there. It's been a closed canopy forest for, probably pushing 80 or 100 years. And so that we didn't have a lot of invasive species and so forth up there. And so it shielded the project from the traffic noise on the highway. And we felt like that it would be a buffer. Some of the property doesn't go all the way out to the highway. And so there are several pieces. There's one being developed at the entrance now that's the Emerson family that we actually work closely with. I'm going to talk about in just a minute. But there's another piece adjacent to them that was another longtime Gainesville family. I see it has a for sale sign on it now. OakAmerk actually owns a little 100-foot strip that goes out to the highway there that is never going to be part of OakAmerk, but it is enough of a nuisance strip that OakAmerk will have a say-so over how intense the development is along the highway. But all of those properties were also subject to the 50% set-aside. And we felt like, hey, they're going to develop the frontage and set aside the back, and that will create even a nicer buffer for us. And in fact, just the sheer size of the area for the critters that live out there would be larger, even though it wasn't all OakAmerk land. It'd be the back half of those lots and so forth. And then adjacent to us on the east was the Serenola Forest, which has now been purchased for conservation by Alachua County and Alachua Conservation Trust. And then there are some property from between the Serenola Forest as you go farther south towards Payne's Prairie that would allow some connectivity for animals to move back and forth and so forth. I assume they're still seeing deer and turkey and things like that were out here when we first started.
And it seems rather unique. This community seems rather unique, right? Especially the way you created this community, right? The way you created this community seems rather unique, right? It's not only did you kind of balance economic needs of the community and everything else, right? But you also found a very purposeful way to mitigate, a lot of these environmental impacts.
Right.
Describe that process a little bit, why that was so important, the way you did things.
Oh, I think that's what people wanted. I had enough control over the process that's what I wanted. I'm on the Alachua Conservation Trust Board. I'm an environmentalist myself. And through my real estate work, I caused a lot of things to be developed. And if you were going to cause those things to be developed in my line of work for the university, I wanted it to be done in a very environmentally sensitive way. And we won environmental awards for the site development. I've got a plaque over by the elevator. Not sure what it all says, but it was a landscape architect and environmental national award that we won. And I felt like we could have a fairly intense site development because we have 125 or something like that acres, 126 acres, and really the main core facilities here are only on 20 or 30. And you have the club homes that are, but they're also pretty natural home sites and around here. And so one of the things that we also tried to do was to create within the core facilities here that sort of urban, walkable, and so forth. I had to talk to the county about a couple of the things we got was how we did the parking in front to create islands with trees. There's a lot of clay out in front, and so I had actually selected a particular type of oak tree to grow in front that didn't do very well, and because the soil's so wet, so they had to replace them later with cypress trees. Actually, they seem to be doing quite well out there right now.
Can we take it back a little? Do you remember any of the founding board of directors at that point, the initial planning stage?
Yes, and my wife is really good with names, and she will help you when she comes in for her interview. She's much better than me. But we had, I worked a lot with Dick Gudikunst, who was health-related professions. He was actually a founding board member and then actually a founding member to move into OakAmerk. Mrs. Kreiser was on there. Bob Franks was on there. We had nursing dean. It'll come to me eventually. We had retired faculty and deans that were interested in moving here. All of those people had, professional expertise in the type of thing we were trying to develop, plus their own personal interest in it. And so it was really, everybody was whole hog into it, and it was a labor of love for everybody. And because I'd say probably a third of the founding board members moved in here. Dr. York, I think. E.T. York was a chancellor of the whole university system at one time, the head of IFAS for many years. He and his wife moved in. And actually during construction, we had a marketing office in one of the office strip centers over by the post office on Southwest 34th Street, and everybody would meet there. And we had over 500 workers on site during construction at our peak, and we were very aggressive about safety. We did not lose a single. We had some people get cut and go get stitched up and come back, but we did not have somebody not be able to come back to work today during the whole process over 2 years. And so we wouldn't let anybody go on the property, prospects, because during construction we had the founding people who put up their deposits, and they were actually allowed to customize their apartments, we even move walls around and so forth. And it's one of the benefits of being a founding person. But we weren't sold out, and so we were showing the place several times per week. And so during the construction, I had an office in the construction trailers for over 2 years out here. I would go over there and pick them up, and no one was allowed on the property unless I drove them around in my four-wheel drive Subaru because it was pretty muddy roads, and I was not going to get those people stuck. But I was probably involved with over 100 of the people making a decision to move here. And so part of me being the tree hugger idea was when they first started coming out here, it was just trail roads through the woods. And I could drive people to a spot and say, yes, this tree will be in your front yard. And so I drove around the big oak tree right out the front. I would drive them up to that oak tree because a little trail road went by there and say, okay, and then here's where the front door is going to be. It's going to be looking down here. And so I became intimately familiar with really the whole piece of 120 acres. And so it was labor loved by me too. I really got into it, and it was the hardest I ever worked because I still had my full-time job at the university. One of the funny things that happened is that I was in the fundraising side, and I was what they called central staff. So when the fundraisers would go call on somebody, say the College of Business or the College of Medicine fundraiser calls on a donor who says, oh, I like that program, I'm going to give you money. How about this piece of real estate? Then I would get involved with that. And so the metrics of my performance were once they gave us the deed to the real estate, the fundraiser got to say, oh, I raised $100,000 or $1 million and put it on their quarterly report. But in fact, we owned a piece of real estate. We didn't have any money. And so my job was to then actually go sell the property. And so my metric was, how many sales did you close this year? And we had just come out of our second university-wide capital campaign, which generally generates a lot of gifts. And so we were going to go 3 or 4 years before we had the next campaign. And part of my job was to sort of, sell that inventory of real estate during that time. And at the time, I was selling about 2 transactions a month, 23 to 25. It was very amazing over about 10 years. It never varied from 23 to 25, no matter what the economy was doing or anything. And so we decided, well, you're not going to be calling on as many people. You'll have time to go out there and build this project. And in 31 years I worked there, the 2 years I closed the most sales in my life were the 2 years I worked out here. Wow. Almost twice as many. So people were getting, their emails answered at 10 and 11 o'clock at night. And so I like to say it was the hardest I ever worked and the most fun I ever had.
Wow,
and
that's great. So talking about costs, do you have like an estimate of the initial plan of construction? Do you have like an estimate that you can?
It was, the actual construction consisted of 7 major construction projects. Each of the buildings, the central core area, the assisted living, the memory support, the skilled nursing, and then all the club homes and extra facilities, the tennis courts, the gardens, and so forth outside. And so we ended up pulling 7 different building permits. The project cost was, the total cost, including all the marketing and carrying everything until it got full, was about $125 million, but our construction budget was in $80-something million. Actually, when we sort of opened the bids, we were 10 or 12 million over budget and had to cut a few things. And so I was in charge of deciding what to cut. And actually, we had a fair amount of contingency money that there's a lot of clay out here. And so in the early days of construction, they're putting the roads and the sewers and things in, foundations for buildings. We spent more of our contingency than we thought we would, and we were getting worried. But then as the project went on, we had virtually nothing else come up that was a surprise that used up our contingency. So at the end of the project, we had contingency money left. And so I ended up adding the big deck in front, and we added much more efficient air conditioning system and some things like that with that kind of money. But let's see. I will say a couple of things about the construction. From the lake in front, we go back about 800 or 1,000 feet, and it's downhill all the way. As a matter of fact, it's downhill to the lake and from all directions, and so there's no outfall. And as we were going to develop this property, and it had all this clay, so the rainwater doesn't really percolate into the ground very well, one of our great fears was that over time, the lake bottom would silt up, and it would perk even less than it did. And the whole lake area out there is part of the stormwater management permit. So we added some things that we weren't required to do. They're called silt boxes. So when the water goes into the storm sewer along the street, it all ends up coming into this box that swirls it around, just like, say, a toilet. And guess what happens? The solids go to the middle, and it has a filtration system in there that takes all the silt and sand and leaves and everything out. And so periodically, they open the manhole and pump it out. And then we developed a maintenance plan to where, you don't want the guys that are blowing the leaves off to blow them into the storm sewer. You got to blow the streets clean. Don't, get everything out of the street so that we're not sending sand and silt and so forth down in the lake. Help keep it as pristine as we can. Before we started construction, because of the Serenola set aside, we actually wrote into the contract some very severe penalties for the contractor if they moved or broke down any of our construction fencing. And we had about 17,000 feet of chain link fence instead of the orange stuff you see these days that the truck can back up and stretch out and so forth. And I marked all 17,000 feet because I knew where each house was going to go. So I had, I could get real close to the house. No, you can't take this tree out because it's 10 feet from the house. It was 5 feet from the house. You can take it out, kind of thing. And so we ended up I probably spent some money that I never told them about that, to shift. Actually, the place that probably really cost some money was the Four Corners intersection right when you come in. There was this spectacular, perfectly shaped, totally mature basket oak that was the OakAmerk logo tree. And the road was going to be too close to it. And I was afraid that, digging up the sewers and everything would mess with the roots. And so there was a couple of other spots. And so the year before we ever started construction, we were getting into pretty good, final plans. I had the surveying company come out and actually survey and mark a line on the ground exactly where the dig line would be to put the curb in, for example. And then we had a tree surgeon come out and surgically root prune these trees so that just a big backhoe wouldn't be ripping their roots apart to try to save them. And I did. And we opened, that was in 2001, before we started construction in 2002. And we opened up in the spring of 2004, and a hurricane hit us that September and blew the two I had worked the hardest on down.
No.
Wow.
So there's no big oak tree out there. But it was when you came around the corner, you were going to see this perfectly shaped.
So nature took care
Nature took care of it, despite our biggest efforts. Let's see. We did that a year in advance to give the trees a year to sort of get over it before they dug right next to it. And it worked because the trees still looked healthy and everything, and the roads got all done. They didn't look stressed, and then the hurricane blew them down because you cut the roots pretty close on one side, and the wind all came from that side. So they just sort of blew over. And they'd have gone just a couple more years, they would have done it. But let's see.
Was there any pushback from the community when you started the project?
We had one interesting situation. When I was saying earlier that we passed all our zoning unanimously. The city and the county was excited about the project for the economic development aspects of it, but the planning staffs realized that we were going to extra steps environmentally on an environmentally sensitive site. We had numerous neighborhood meetings offering, for example, the trail over to Idlewild. No, you don't want it? Okay, we won't do it. We weren't going to cram anything down anybody's throat. We felt like we were going to have a population of 300 or 400 people here that might, if 10% of them decided they wanted to volunteer in the school, the school would benefit from that. And I think people do that, but they just can't ride a golf cart over there through the woods.
Sorry, please. What school are you referring to?
Idlewild Elementary School. Okay. Which is just east of us. And actually, here's a little side story. The highway out front is a state highway, and it's what they call part of the intrastate, not interstate system. And when you're part of the intrastate system, there are rules about how close stoplights can be and how often you can have a driveway are more limited than on other types of roads. And so there's a stoplight where you go out and turn and go back up 23rd towards campus. And our entrance was too close to ever get a stoplight. But if you go a little bit farther east, the school buses going into the Idlewild School, they were talking about putting a stoplight there. And the school buses would have to make a couple of turns going through the school and so forth. And at the time, we didn't know the Serenola piece east of here was never going to be developed. And the reason that the entry road goes over in dead ends is that we talked the DOT into relocating the potential stoplight site to our site, because when the next piece of property got developed, which it never will be now, but at the time, they were going to make the developer extend the road, because if you extend that road and draw a line straight through the woods, it ends up at Idlewild. And so then the school buses would have a safe stoplight to turn in and out of this busy highway. Let's see. So I've told you a couple of these things. We did some very interesting things with Gainesville Regional Utilities. On the back, down the east side of the property is a major power line that brings power into Gainesville mostly for the university. But then it turns east, and GRU has power lines out there, and so they have big, wide, clear right-of-way. Like I said, everything goes downhill, so we needed a sewer lift station to handle we were going to have to install a lift station. We started talking to GRU about where should we put it. And we brainstormed one day down at GRU, and they had, I can't remember, it was 2 or 3 old, ancient lift stations in Idlewild that were getting ready to have like $100,000 or $150,000 renovations. It's going to be like $300,000 or $400,000 GRU was going to have to spend. And we decided if we went and put our lift station actually off the property, way over on the side near Idlewild, it was downhill there all the way, that GRU, for a whole lot less money, could redirect those 3 lift stations they had in Idlewild over to this lift station and not have to spend all that money. And so they'd modernize the sewage collection system over there. But also, all 3 of those lift stations were way deep down residential streets with closed canopy trees all over it. And when the hurricane comes and the lift station and the power goes out, GRU takes generators over to the lift stations to make them work, so the sewage doesn't just fill up and run on the ground. And so they knew they would have a hard time getting to these lift stations if next time we had a storm. But if our lift station was right next to the big, wide power line right away, they could just drive right up to it, put the lift in. So that was another advantage that they felt like. And then, so we ended up doing that. And they were so proud of themselves, they actually put they initiated an agenda item on the city commission agenda to brag about it one time. The other thing was that the south end of Gainesville is really downhill from the majority of Gainesville, and they were having all kinds of water pressure issues. I mean, too high a water pressure on everything on the south side of town, south of Williston Road. And west of town, there was new development, and they had inadequate water over there. So we ended up running the water line all the way down the big power line through OakAmerk and out our west road to connect those 2 water systems and balance the pressure over this whole southwest side of town. So GRU was proud of that. And so we sort of traded them. All the roads inside of OakAmerk are private. And normally if you have a water line start leaking under a private road, it's your responsibility to fix it. But because we allowed them to do all these things that benefited them, there's an ancient agreement that says, hey, if it blows out over here, they'll come fix it. So we did, we had great collaboration with GRU. One important thing that happened that allowed us to finish on time and within budget was that I had, in my work for the university, had been involved with several other development projects, and I had had a wonderful relationship with a site work contractor. It was Buck Johnson and Son, the red trucks you see around town. And Buck was the grandfather, but the son, who was retirement age at the time, was Glenn, and his son, Glenn Jr., were the people I dealt with. And as we began to bid out different parts of the construction work, I had such a good working relationship with them, and they had been sensitive to trees and some things on some other projects I had done. I wanted to work with them, and they actually got the bid. I had to bid for it, got low bid. And we weren't going to start construction for 6 or 8 months. I get a call one day right after they got the bid and said, hey, do you mind if we go out there and just sort of check the site out? And I said, sure, I'll meet you. Well, it's still just trail roads through the woods. So when they drive up, they're pulling a trailer with a little backhoe on it. And they got off the backhoe, and I knew where everything would go. No, this is where the road's going to go. There's just a sewer line over here. And they go over there, and they dig it out a little bit and see what kind of soil was there, and then they cover it back up. They just wanted to know what they were getting into. So that was a good visit. And they said, well, you know, when you start a big project like this, there's a legal thing called a notice to proceed. Once you've got your financing in place, you give your contractor a notice you can go start work. He says, you know, the first thing they're going to say is, have you cleared the site? No, it's all woods. We didn't have a road in. The west entrance road was 800 feet off the road, no road there. They said, would you mind if we came out here and started work early, because otherwise we're going to have these people breathing down our neck. We would like to have them, you know, on day one, you'd like to be able to drive a truck into the property to start work. And I said, yeah, but you know, we haven't sold the bonds. You know, I mean, you're doing it at your risk. And he says, well, if the project goes forward, you promise to pay? And I said, yes, and we shook on it. And they came out here. We were supposed to sell the bonds in early September, and they came out here in April. And that's when I did we started doing the chain link, the 17,000 feet of chain link fences. And then they started over building the road so people could come to the site.
Was that in 2001?
That was in 2002.
Oh, okay.
And so, yes. And so at one point, and as we got closer to construction, the contractor came in and he had cleared a site for them, and they set up the construction trailers and everything. I had an office there, and you were way on the back corner, and you could look down through the cleared site. And I remember one day standing there, I saw 17 pieces of equipment all moving. And this company came out and was ready to go on day one. But the funny part of the story is there was a glitch in the financing, and we didn't sell the bonds the 1st of September. And we actually did it at the end of October. But there's about 6 or 7 weeks in there. And Mr. Johnson had been paying his employees and carrying the project, and he was retirement age, and he had this big black SUV, shiny as it can be. And we had the cell phones back then had a walkie-talkie function. That we all had gotten the same cell phone, so all the people on the site, the managers and construction managers and so forth, could talk to each other. And I get this in, bing, bing, Mr. Johnson's on site, he's looking for you. And as we went week after week, and every week after the bonds were supposed to sell, he would drive around and see everything, and I would meet him, and we'd shake on it again. And when we actually closed the bonds, we wrote him something like a $1.4 million check for all the work he had done. But the first building is on the side of the hill, and you had to cut a wedge of soil out of the ground 17 feet deep in the back. And he had cut that out and put the yellow sand in, and it was ready for the plumber to start putting the sewer line in. And the elevator, the first guy that shows up is the elevator guy. He has to dig a shaft through the hole and do that. And they were able to tell the elevator guy on day one, when the notice to proceed was issued, no, we're ready for you. And Mr. Johnson, that 6-month head start he had, really is why we finished on time and within budget. And they're one of the heroes, the hidden heroes of how this project came to pass.
So essentially just establishing that relationship and trust, right?
It was, if the deal, I would have had to quit my job. I mean, I shook on it. He was relying on me, and if something had gone wrong and the project didn't go forward, you know, I would have lost my job.
Wow.
And I had confidence we were going to go forward, but But he did over $1 million worth of work, a 20-year-old $1 million, you know, on a handshake. Yeah, yeah. So anyway, that was gotten down to there. Tell you one other quick story. The type of bonds we sold were sort of an eclectic thing that were being mostly bought by European banks. And there were all these restrictions that they required that your architect has designed a CCRC at like 4 or 5 before and have a track record, and that your contractor had built one. And so both of them were from out of state. And but the university was booming at the time, and I knew a bunch of the people in the construction world. I mean, I was the real estate guy over there. And they were having to import tradespeople from Atlanta. I mean, tile setters and stuff like that. And so I knew if you brought this out-of-state construction firm into town, they were going to have a real hard time getting access to the local trades to build the place. And so I ended up insisting that the out-of-town contractor form a partnership with one of the biggest local companies. And that worked out famously and helped us to get access to all the trades. And then, what was I going to... so that was... Oh. So they're coming down to inspect to see if they're really going to make the loan. And I'm, of course, the guy giving them the tour. Nobody's allowed on site without there in my four-wheel drive Subaru. And we're driving around, and they want to know what are my qualifications to be in charge of construction. I didn't have a lot. I hadn't gone to school building construction or anything like that. But I had built several buildings for the university. I built Emerson Hall, design all the way to the finish of it and things like that, and several other buildings for the foundation. And so I'm telling them about that. And then they said, well, how do we know you'll stay here through the rest of construction? And I said, my mother is one of the founding depositors, and I can never let her down. It's the last question they asked me. And so my mother she was like the 12th person to move in. Wow. And so, let's see. The other thing that happened that was pretty interesting is that when you have this big a construction project, you're calling for inspections every day. And really big projects will make a deal with the government agency to have what they call a dedicated inspector. And so give him a trailer out here, because we're going to, by the time he drives back downtown, somebody, got 7 different projects going at once, they're going to be calling for the next inspection. And so we had done that and paid a big price for it. And, but one of the bean counters there was not giving us credit for that separate contract in our building permit costs. And so I'd had a fuss with him, and it had to be resolved by the county manager. And once we told the story, he said, we're right, and everything was fine after that. And so we go fast forward about 6 months in the construction time, and we're looking at our operating budgets. And, when you move in out here, OakAmerk pays all the utility bills. Well, we were in the county, and the county was charging a 25% surcharge on GRU water and sewer and a 10% surcharge on electric. And they were projecting like $120,000 a month utility bill out here. And so if we could get rid of the 25% and the 10% surcharges, they estimated we were going to save about $25,000 to $30,000 a month. So right in the middle of construction, I went down and filed for voluntary annexation into the city so that we would be in the city by the time we opened up and started paying those bills. And the county manager heard about our annexation thing, and he thought it was related to our squabble over the inspector thing and everything. And he goes ballistic, and we have to go down and have a meeting, and all the suits are there and stuff like that. And in fact, it just had nothing to do with it whatsoever. It had worked out famously. We solved our differences, and this was all just about $25,000 a month in our final budget, which is a big number. So one of our little dust-ups. I think I'll just sort of finish. I see everybody's peeking in here and starting to look at their watches and everything. When we got all finished, one of the things that we had added was the deck out front. And actually, the two big palm trees in front were really expensive. They were so expensive, I was objecting. But they were supposed to be across the road. And when we got ready to do the deck is all shaded on that side. That's east. When are people here going to use it? In the afternoon. The building's here. There's no trees. It was just going to be cooking in the sun. And so I had them move the palm trees over to the front of the building, and then we bought those oak trees that are now getting pretty big and shading the deck. But everything beyond the deck is part of the preserve, and we were going to put uplights on the trees. And it was one of the last things we were going to do. And I'll finish with this because the contractors were starting to demobilize because the 7 projects finished at different times. Like we opened the two apartment wings and the central core first, but the skilled nursing was the last thing to open 6 or 8 months later. Anyway, so things are beginning to wind down. We're just getting the last part built. And Shane Bauer, who was the head of all the construction of the whole project, and I had gotten to be close friends. And he says, the guys are going to be putting those uplights on the trees, and they can't really adjust them until it's after dark. How about we get a little cooler of beer, and we'll go sit down there in the woods, and we got our walkie-talkie radios, and we'll tell the guys to, move it over a little this way, move it over a little this way. And we had started to move people in. And we were down there in the woods, out of sight, doing that, having a couple of beers. It was down to the last couple of weeks, that we were going to be on site. And I started seeing people, couples, walking up and down. And the place was coming to life. And I cried. And I still cry 20 years later. So that was, like I said, hardest I ever worked, most fun I ever had. So there's my story.
That's a great one. I was also going to ask, so far, do you think OakAmerk has developed into what you initially imagined?
Yes. Yes, I think it has. There's a few things that we were sort of young and dumb about. Leslie Bram is, I know, someone else you're going to interview. Leslie and I were very, very close, and the two people from the university that probably had the most time involved in the place. And one of the things that she did was we wanted to have all these relationships between OakAmerk and every single college on campus. And so she negotiated these agreements with every single dean of how they would relate to this, to make it an opportunity for the university for education, but also an opportunity for the residents to access the, what the university has to offer. And she put a tremendous amount of effort in that. And in the end, I think a number of the colleges have ongoing, constant relationships here, but some of them, it just wasn't a good fit and it never worked out. So that's probably one thing, but I think the integration and the collaboration between the university and OakAmerk has, in general, worked out the way we thought it would. I guess one other little side story, I will say this, that there was a story, the president said this, when we were planning the budgets. We rounded everything up on what we spent on kitchen, facilities, and the food budget. Because the president said, if the people aren't happy, they're going to call the president of the university, and I don't want any calls. So when we first opened, people said, wow, the food is great. The kitchen staff said, wow, look at these cool facilities. We can do anything we want. But we weren't going to scrimp on that. Yes, I think it has. I may eventually move here myself, And my mother lived here for the rest of her days, and it proved to be everything we thought it would be for her. 100% happy with the way it worked out for my family. And so, yes, I think it has. We put a lot of time and energy and effort into creating something that is, I think, operating the way we did it, the way we planned.
So what do you think is most unique about the OakAmerk compared to other retirement community?
The things that make it a CCRC, so that it's not a la carte. I have some other relatives right now that we're dealing with end-of-life situations on, and if you go into a lot of places, it's one price, but then as you move up in the levels of care, suddenly it gets very unaffordable pretty quickly if you don't have a lot of assets or a lot of long-term care insurance and so forth. And so that sort of level price, certainly they're going to bill Medicare, and they want you to have those of us on Medicare, you guys are too young, but you get Medicare, but you buy a supplement to pay what Medicare won't. So they want you to have a supplement. They're going to bill your insurance and everything, but they keep you from going broke if you get to that point in your life where you need the extra services. The other part of it is it keeps people active, and there was some data out there that when we were first planning the project that people who were involved in an active retirement community like this lived years and years longer than people who weren't. And I think that's proven to be the case.
Could you just tell us some of those activities like the residents engage in?
Everything from just the social interaction of seeing people every day is valuable. The community gardens, the education stuff that's going on right now up in the Leslie Ram Ballroom, or whatever they call it, the largest room up there that we built. You go to the basketball games, and there's the OakAmerk bus dropping people off, and it's waiting for them when the game is over to pick them back up. The interaction with the university, all those things. When you have declining mobility, that is really one of the number one health risks that elderly people face. And so if you can sustain your mobility as long as you possibly can, that's one of the things that we were trying to do out here. And then allow people to age in place. So that, part of this is if you're in your apartment and your spouse needs assisted living, you got both places. And interestingly enough, they're telling me now, as healthcare has changed, we actually thought we were cutting edge when we made some of our assisted living rooms sort of 2 rooms, so that if you're still fine but your spouse needs it, if you want to, you can go down there too. And apparently that's something nobody wants. Anyway, and Medicare is paying for more of the services to come to your apartment as opposed to there. So some of the ideas that we had haven't worked out very well, but they were cutting edge at the time, and I don't think they've worked out poorly. They just didn't work out as well as we thought we would. But others, I'm sure they'll tell you, have worked out better than we ever thought they would.
I've also noticed that, kind of based off the hallway here, you have quite a bit of activities, woodworking, hiking, quite a variety of stuff. It's pretty amazing.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so that's the whole idea. If you keep on going, you only die when you stop. Yeah. And so there's a lot of people out here that are doing a lot of things that, if they were at home, what would they do? Sitting in a bar lounge and watching, the Olympics all day long. Okay, you can watch the Olympics all day if you want, but you don't want to keep doing that once the Olympics are over.
It's true. Do you have any question?
No, that's it.
Do you have any question? Okay. So, do you have any other comments or anything you would like to talk about?
No, the only thing I had left on my outline is that there were so many little special arrangements that I made around the perimeter of the property and certain things that they need to keep an eye on, like don't forget to pump out the silt boxes, kind of thing that they've had several new CEOs, and every time they invite me out and I have that long lunch with the CEO, and a couple times we've gone in the boardroom in the executive offices there and pulled out the old maps and point out something to them. And so Andrew stopped me in the hall here and said he'll come back and get me and introduce me to the new CEO, because they have a new one now. And so I'm able to continue to pass on those little tidbits of information that they don't need to forget that help make the place what it is. And so I'm going to probably do that while y'all interview my wife.
So, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Yeah,
This is
a
labor of love, and as I have told a number of men over the years, it's the closest a man ever gets to birthing a baby.
I'm curious, were you ever involved with the McCarty Wood stuff?
No. No, interestingly enough, I did very little on campus.
Okay.
I was basically when the campus edge, that's where I was, because I was the foundation. The foundation was private. And so we did, we did 9 hotels out at the Archer Road interchange, which was gift property. So, 9 hotels, Cracker Barrel, and that kind of thing. So I did all kinds of things around the edges of campus, but they had their own, physical plant people.
Yeah, because I'm a non-other guy too, so I really appreciate all the work you've been doing, specifically the way you created this. It's and
I've been following the. I'm still engaged. I've been following the McCarty Woods.
Yeah, I was actually one of the organizers on that. And, I just raised about another $2,500 for enhancement efforts. So I tried to do my best.
Sure, everybody has to do kick in and do a little bit, as much or as little as you can.
Absolutely.
Whenever you can.
But thank you for your work on keeping this preserved and for.
Well, if they don't take too long, I always, whenever I'm out here, I do walk around, and when I leave, I actually drive all the roads. So, well, thank you. I appreciate y'all contacting me to do this. Hopefully, it leaves a little bit of legacy, because I still am seeing some of those founding members that 20-something years ago, I'm seeing some obituaries, and I know there's not too many left. I came out a couple of years ago when the last new CEO they had, and we had lunch, and I didn't recognize anybody. Wow. But then they had just opened the new skilled nursing wing, so I got to go on the loop tour, and we got over to assisted living, and there was like a dozen people all having a late lunch around the table, and I knew every one of them because they had aged in place, and they were now back there.